I'd like to introduce and demonstrate Monte Carlo methods. Monte Carlo methods or Monte Carlo simulations or Monte Carlo modeling are kind of a broad general class of computational techniques that rely or based on generating random numbers, rely or based on generating sequences of random numbers. So Monte Carlo simulations are common in physics, but they're also very common, very useful in other sciences such as chemistry, biology, mathematics. They're used in engineering, they're used in economics, they're used in finance and other areas. So they're a very important technique, they're a very common technique, and they're a very powerful technique. Monte Carlo simulations are essentially or effectively randomized experiments. They're like conducting or performing a sequence of many randomized experiments in order to solve a particular problem, to solve a particular physics problem or other problem of interest. So the earliest Monte Carlo method, which actually didn't involve a computer, but is akin to a Monte Carlo method, was the estimation of pi by a method that involves dropping needles onto a floor where the floor is marked with parallel lines that are separated by units of the needle length. And if you drop a needle onto the floor, it is marked with these lines, there's some probability that it will overlap or not overlap with one of the lines. It will cross or not cross one of the lines. If you drop many needles onto the floor and you count how many overlap, how many don't overlap, you can use that information to calculate pi, to compute pi. And that's an example of a Monte Carlo method for calculating pi. You conduct many experiments, you perform many experiments, you drop many needles on the floor, and the outcome of those experiments determines a quantity or determines a parameter that you're interested in. The first record of a Monte Carlo simulation using a computer is due to a person you know, Enrico Fermi, who used it to study neutron diffusion. So neutrons are constituents of atomic nuclei. Neutrons are neutral particles. Neutrons can diffuse through matter. They can diffuse through different materials. And they randomly walk through the matter. And Enrico Fermi used the Monte Carlo method, a Monte Carlo modeling or a Monte Carlo simulation to explore and study that diffusion of neutrons as they randomly walk through a material. So we're going to apply our Monte Carlo method to this classic example of the indeterministic nature of quantum physics, of this classic example of radioactivity, radioactive decay. The particular radioactive decay chain that I want to consider is one that involves a couple of subatomic particles that are unstable, short-lived. One of them is called a pion. You might have heard of that. It has a lifetime that's 26 nanoseconds. The other one is called a muon. You might have heard of that particle. It has a lifetime that's about 2200 nanoseconds. Now, both those lifetimes seem very short on everyday scales, 26 nanoseconds, 2200 nanoseconds. But for particles of nature, for unstable particles of nature, those lifetimes are actually rather long. 26 nanoseconds or 2,200 nanoseconds. This is a rather long lifetime for an unstable subatomic particle. This radioactive decay chain of these unstable particles, where a pion decays through the weak force into a muon by emitting neutrinos, and the muon itself decays into an electron through a weak decay and emitting neutrinos. This is a very famous radioactive decay chain. And this was a decay chain that has been used to understand the building blocks of what we call the Standard Model, the model that describes the fundamental particles of nature and the elementary interactions between those particles. So it's a very important, very well-known decay chain, and we're going to explore this. Now, it is a decay chain that has that form of some species A that's unstable, decaying to some species B that's unstable, that decays to some species C that is stable. In our case, A is the pion, B is the muon, and C is the electron. And we're going to compute this decay chain and explore this decay chain. We're going to explore the populations of the number of pions, number of muons, number of the electrons. Now, I'm going to show you my code for calculating just the first step in this decay, pions decaying to muons. And then in the associated assignment, you'll calculate the two steps in this decay, pions to muons and then muons to electrons. But you'll see that in the Monte Carlo method for this particular problem, in the Monte Carlo simulation of this particular problem, whether you've just got a simple decay of pions into muons, or you've got a decay chain of pions to muons to electrons, the procedure is very similar and it's very straightforward, whether you're calculating a single decay or you're calculating a decay chain. So this is my code, my Python code for calculating the decay of pions into muons, specifically calculating the number of pions I have as a function of time and the number of muons that I have as a function of time based on the radioactive decay law. In the first cell, I'm going to define some parameters of the problem that I want to solve, and a couple of other quantities relating to the discrete time that I'm going to work in. So firstly, I'm going to think of starting with a certain number of pions and having no initial muons. And I'm going to watch the population of the number of pions and number of muons evolve from that initial conditions, boundary conditions. So in my example here, I'm going to start with a number of pions, I called it n pi, that's 100, and I'm going to start with a number of muons, I called it n mu, that's 0. So those are my initial conditions. And then I've added one more parameter, I called it tau, tau for lifetime. I could have introduced a decay rate, but it's that one or other of those parameters that determines how fast or slow the rate at which the pions decay into muons. And pions decay into muons with a lifetime of 26 nanoseconds. So here's my lifetime in units of nanoseconds. Two more parameters, a dt and a Tmax. These refer to the time over which I'm going to calculate the pion population and the muon population, and the intervals between consecutive discrete times that I will calculate the pion and muon population. So I'm going to calculate the population of muons and pions at 1 nanosecond intervals. That's the one here, dt. And I'm going to calculate them over a period, the duration of 100 nanoseconds. That's the T max here. And so that's going to be my little time world of 100 time points from 0 to 100 nanoseconds. There's one final quantity that I calculated. It's kind of a convenience. It's just a handy thing to simplify the code a little bit. I'm going to be asking in my Monte Carlo simulation, in each nanosecond, whether each pion has decayed or not. And so here I'm calculating the probability, the chance that a pion decays in that single nanosecond. If I take the dt, 1 nanosecond, and I divide it by the lifetime, 26 nanoseconds, that's the probability, that's the chance that the pion decays in that 1 nanosecond interval. Now, the numbers are that dt is 1 nanosecond, the pion lifetime is 26 nanoseconds. So that probability is about 0.04%, just slightly under 0.04, just slightly under 0.04, or it's 4%. And so that's the scale of the probability or the chance of the decay. And I'm going to keep using that number. So the second cell is where I actually calculate the populations of the different species as a function of time. I define an array that contains the discrete time intervals. So I use this numpy function here. Is going to create an array of times from 0 to the maximum time with time steps of dt. And then I'm going to build two lists that will contain the populations of the pions and the muons as a function of time. So there's NP list and NM list for my pion and muon time distributions or population distributions. Here I'm just declaring them. So initially they're empty, but then I'm going to keep appending to them the populations as I calculate the populations. Now here's the real body of the code for the calculation. Firstly, I've got one for loop in which I'm going to loop over the discrete times from 0 to 100 nanoseconds. The first thing I do in that loop, if we look at what I do, is I'm going to put the current values of the populations of pions and muons. I'm going to append those to my list of the time dependence of the populations of the pions and the muons. So I store the current values of the populations. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to calculate how many pions decay in this particular 1 nanosecond interval. So I start by declaring a new variable, the number of decays in this 1 nanosecond interval, and I'm going to define it initially to be 0. And then I'm going to loop over all the pions that I have surviving at this particular time. You know, if it's the first time through the loop, it's going to be 100 pions. But if it's a later time through the loop, there's going to be less pions. I'm going to loop over all the surviving pions. And in this if statement here, I'm going to determine whether or not they decay in this time interval. And it's based on the Monte Carlo method, is based on getting a random number. This is a random floating point number from 0 to 1. And if that random floating point number is less than 0.04 approximately, the probability for decay, then that means that this pion that I'm asking this question about has decayed. And if that pion does decay, if this control statement is true, then I'm going to increment the number of decays. I'm going to add 1 to the number of pions decayed in this time interval. And by doing this, when I come out of this nested for loop, n decay will have changed from being initialized as 0 to being the number of decays of pions in that time interval. Then all I've got to do to update the population of pions and muons is to subtract n decay from the number of pions, because they've now gone away, and add n decay to the number of muons, because I've now produced some more muons. And so in this way, I'm accounting for the loss of pions and the gain of muons through the pion decay into muons. And so let's execute this cell. And then in this final cell, I'm just going to plot. I'm going to plot the time distribution of the pions that are in the list, NP list. And I'm going to plot, secondly, the time distribution of muons that are in the list, NM list. I'm going to plot the pions in magenta, plot the muons in green. So let's execute this cell. And this is what we see. So horizontally is the time from 0 to 100 nanoseconds. That's the time window we are interested in following the decay for. Vertically is the number of pions or number of muons. So pions is in magenta, muons is in green. We see that initially, right? There's 100 pions. We started with a sample of 100 pions. And initially, we had no muons. We started with 0 muons. But you see on the time scale of the pion lifetime that the number of pions decays away exponentially, and the number of muons grows exponentially. You see that it's not a smooth exponential for the pion or the muon appearance or disappearance. It has statistical fluctuations, but we're statistically mapping out the population growth of the muons and the population disappearance of the pions. And we've solved this particular pion decay problem by a very simple Monte Carlo method. And it shows the power of the Monte Carlo method. Now, in the assignment for today's class, I'm going to ask you to do the same sort of Monte Carlo simulation, but for the entire decay chain of pions to muons to electrons, rather than just the first step in the chain from pions to muons. So in this assignment, you're going to define some region of time over which you're interested in the populations of pions, muons, and electrons now. This is going to be a longer time period because the muons survive longer, the pions survive a shorter period of time. So we're going to use a longer period of time, 1,000 nanoseconds. And also, in this case, instead of following 2 species, pions and muons, you're going to have to follow 3 species, pions, muons, and electrons. So you're going to want 3 arrays or 3 lists to follow these 3 populations. In your loop, in your for loop, where you do the Monte Carlo modeling, where you do the Monte Carlo simulation, where you keep generating random numbers to ask the question, did the pion decay? You're going to change that to be asking 2 questions. Well, did the pion decay for each surviving pion? Did the muon decay for each surviving muon? So that's the big change that turns a single decay into the decay chain. It's a straightforward change. And that's kind of the beauty of the Monte Carlo method. That's the simplicity of the Monte Carlo method in studying and exploring decay chains. It's very easy to simulate, to model complicated decay chains.